Welcome to the Straight Up 30, where we make policy make sense in 30 minutes or less. I'm your host, Ross Izard, and today you get to see me in a suit because I've been running around at the Capitol with Steve Johnson from State Policy Network. He is a fellow with the Center for Practical Federalism. Did I get that right?
You got that right.
And we are out here talking to a whole bunch of different folks about the issue of federal grants transparency, which is something that I'm guessing most folks have not thought a whole lot about and probably don't fully understand. And I'm hoping we can work through it here today.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, why don't we start with this? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and also tell us a little bit about what State Policy Network is.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on first. My background, I'm from Michigan. I actually served 6 years in the Michigan legislature, 2016 through 2022. And after leaving, I joined State Policy Network. And our network is all the state-based free market think tanks. So Independence Institute here in Colorado, Michigan where I'm at, Mackinac Center. And we exist to help them out. And one of the problems that we see is the federal government is growing more and more and more, and you're seeing more decisions happen at the federal level and less at the state level. And so we're saying, all right, we have all these great state-based think tanks, but at some point, the state capitals are just an administrative arm of the federal government. And that's not how our country was. It wasn't how it was designed to run. And so we need to sort of bring federalism back. Bring power back to states, to local communities, and to the people. And so we stood up the Center for Practical Federalism and said, what are practical ways that state lawmakers can reassert their authority and protect themselves against federal overreach? And so that's kind of what brings me here today.
So tell me a little bit about the concept of federalism, because I think we've all heard it in school. I think most of us probably know what it means, but tell me specifically how that concept applies to how state legislatures relate to Congress or the federal government generally.
Yeah, that's the problem with federalism is most people don't know what it means. Even some state lawmakers, you ask them, they think federalism means a bigger federal government. And it's like, well, nope, actually it's the exact opposite. Federalism is the idea that there is some power with the national government, all right? We don't want a federal government that doesn't exist, that's too weak. There's national defense, there's immigration, there's certain things that we say the federal government needs to do these things. But most power resides with the states and more importantly with the people. And that's sort of a 10th Amendment argument, right? Any power that's not expressly delegated for the federal government, it goes to states, into the people. And so, and there's different definitions of federalism, different kind of takes on it. What we sort of believe in is what is the constitutional framework that we have. And that's kind of what we want to support.
You said something important there, which is that this is constrained largely within the context of whatever's not decided by the states is left up to the federal government. And so there's not a lot of room in a lot of cases, and I think this is where folks get tripped up. People sort of assume that because Congress is what you hear about most often, that Congress are the folks who are making decisions for you and your state. And the reality is, by Constitution, they really can't do that, but they have other ways of exerting influence, primarily in the form of funding, which includes both federal funding generally and federal grants.
Yes, so that's the thing. The federal government is limited in a lot of ways, and yet they have all this power and say, well, where does that come from? It comes from federal money. And that's sort of been their way to sort of weasel into a lot of these decisions to say, well, if you want these dollars for, say, education for your schools, that's great, but now you need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's very difficult. I mean, I was an elected official. It's hard to say no to those quote unquote free dollars from the federal government, even though we know they're not free. But it's really tempting to take those, and understandably so. However, you now open the door to let the feds have a say in how you run your state. And sometimes it's worth it. Sometimes you say, look, the amount of money they can provide is far more valuable than the cost it is to us. But at certain points, you maybe look and say, well, the strings attached to that grant are not at all worth taking that. And that's where we want state lawmakers to start to have that conversation. Don't just view yourself as, how can I get as much federal money as possible? Let's get every single dollar. Because that's what a lot of state bureaucrats do. All right, they want to grow their agency. They want to get every dollar towards them. We want to refocus that and say, think about the cost it takes when you take that money. Is it worth it? It might be. We're not making the value judgment on if it's a good or a bad grant, but we want you, the state lawmaker, to start to think, instead of, can I get as much money as possible, is it worth it or not?
And the only way to really be able to answer that question is to be able to understand where the money is going. And you said something important there, which is that there are kind of two buckets of federal funding. The first one is general funding for government operations. And the clearest example of this for me in a lot of cases is federal funding for education. And we've seen all sorts of fights all over the country about federal funding to state education agencies if they comply with this, that, or the other. And it depends on which administration happens to be in power. The requirements change, but that's a straight funding source to the state itself. Another part, though, is the grants. That's the second bucket of money that is distributed to the state, usually to a state agency, and then distributed from the state agency to someone to do something. So maybe walk us through a little bit of sort of how that grant process works so the folks are able to understand the way that that money flows from the federal government and the types of projects that it might find its way into.
Yeah, I mean, there's basically infinite number of these dollars coming down, right? I mean, it seems like it's so large from the federal government, and it's transportation money, it's education dollars, it's in healthcare, it's in DNR, natural resource issues. It's every facet of government, it seems, is getting grant money from the federal government, and oftentimes it's not the state agency that's performing it. They're actually awarding it to it's a nonprofit or some other agency to take those dollars and complete some project. What we, and this kind of our conversations with a lot of people today, is what are those grants? How many are there? What does it cost? Who's receiving them? That's where one of our items that we score states on is, do you have good federal grant transparency? It's very simple. Do you have a website that we can put this information on that anyone can easily go and look at it and view it and sort of see what's going on? We had some discussions with some folks on it, and a lot of the information is there, but it's sort of hidden in a spreadsheet that no one can either find, or it's really complicated, or you got to go look at different spreadsheets and sort of put all the pieces together. And so what we're saying is, can we maybe put that information together in one easy to access location that anyone can go and start to see what is the impact of the federal government on our state?
Because right now, I mean, the information is technically public, which is to say that it exists somewhere out there. But just in Colorado alone, we have dozens of state agencies that then are divided up into dozens of individual divisions. And then those are receiving this grant money. So the federal government or some subdivision of the federal government sends a package of grant money to a state agency. It trickles down to a division. The division then runs a grant process of some kind, and the money then flows out to someone. Like you said, it might be a nonprofit. It could be an organization of some kind. And then it sort of disappears. And you, if you're motivated, could go out and find this. So you could send an email to the state agency and hope that they're willing to help you. You could file an open records request and see if you could dig in and find this stuff that way. You could drive yourself insane searching around on Google and seeing if it exists online. But the fact of the matter is, for the amount of money that's flowing through, and it's worth mentioning, this is millions or hundreds of millions of dollars coming through, there's remarkably little information available to people about how much money there is, who's getting it, and what exactly they're using it for, which when you start asking questions like the ones you just did, if you don't have that information, you don't really have a starting place. And that causes all kinds of problems down the line.
Well, and you lose trust as a taxpayer, right? I mean, as someone who's paying their taxes, you want to make sure that your money is being spent wisely. And I think there's always sort of an assumption that, hey, it's government, it's not going to be spent perfectly, but I don't want it to be completely all fraudulently spent. And as you see some of the more recent revelations, like Minnesota, right? You saw the learning centers there. A lot of them maybe weren't actually spending the dollars on kids that it was meant to go to. Some of the autism places that were saying, all right, it seemed like the numbers were a lot higher than what's in reality. There is a lot of that money being stolen. We look at some projects in California where they're going to build these bridges, and well, they never actually really happen, but tens of millions of dollars get spent. I think it's fair for a taxpayer to say, is the money that's being sent to my state or even to another state, is it actually being spent appropriately? And what's the outcome? If you got a $500,000 grant to, restore a wetlands project, did it get restored? Or is that money sort of sitting there and there's a construction crew that showed up and nothing really ever happened? That's fair for the taxpayer to wonder. And if we don't even know about the grants because it's hidden beneath, layers and layers of bureaucracy, and you can't find out where exactly what money's coming in and where it went to, well, now the public doesn't have that opportunity to really see how it's being spent. But if you do a simple process of, hey, we're putting it out there, anyone can see it, now people can start to double check and see maybe it did get spent. Maybe we're actually proud of the money that got spent. Maybe we're happy about it. And I know we talked about some of the states that have good scores on our transparency metrics. It is not Republican states. It's not Democrat states, right? So I think Oregon and Hawaii, pretty far left states. Then Indiana and Iowa, pretty far right states. Pennsylvania, Arizona, kind of purple states. Rhode Island, New Hampshire. It's a mix. They have really high scores on this. And then other states that are deep red have bad scores, and other states that are deep blue have bad scores. It's not partisan. We might have partisan differences on whether we support an individual grant or not, and that's a standard political argument, and that's why we have elections to sort of have those discussions. But what isn't political, or at least it shouldn't be, is the transparency aspect of, all right, what are these dollars? Can I look into it, and can we make that determination if this is worth it or not?
I mean, one of my favorite kinds of issues is the kind of issue where it cuts across party lines and across philosophical lines in interesting ways. And one of the most fascinating things about this conversation has been, as you said, people are coming at it from all different angles, right? So you might have somebody who's concerned about it because they're worried that the money has been wasted or used fraudulently or whatever. You might have somebody else who comes at it and is really primarily interested in it because they think something was great and it was a great outcome that they want to study and maybe replicate or write about or whatever it might be. They could be a Republican. They could be a Democrat. They could be a taxpayer, which obviously is the most important person to be providing transparency to, since they're the folks who are ultimately funding it. But it's not all just those folks either. And I think one of the interesting things for me with the conversations that we've been having has been that there's actually an interest in this, not just from a public transparency perspective, but from a policymaker perspective, as far as how do we make good decisions based on what's happening now and the outcomes that's producing, and get the information that we need to start making policy changes or recommendations or picking up learning lessons wherever they might exist. And it's funny to look at a central policy theme and the idea of transparency with this constellation of different people who are aligned with all sorts of different philosophical beliefs, and yet they all agree, yeah, it would really help if we could see that, if we could understand it better.
Yeah, no, that's been amazing, kind of seeing how, I'm a conservative, right? So I talk to conservative lawmakers, and it makes very much sense to them. It's like, well, yeah, this is pretty obvious. But then we talk to people who are very liberal, and they also see the benefit to it. And like, well, of course they do. This is actually something we can agree on. And it's fun where you can be in a room with someone where it's like, man, I probably disagree on a lot of topics with you, but we agree on this one. And we might agree for different reasons. We might be coming at it from very different angles, but there's still an agreement. This information should be easily accessible, should be transparent to the public. And not, when I say to the public, it's not just like anyone in the public, it's also lawmakers. How it's interesting how many lawmakers don't even know this. And you say, all right, if you're tasked with voting on a budget and maybe writing the budget, and this information isn't easily accessible to you, that's a really big problem. So we're even sort of hearing lawmakers saying, yeah, I want to see this information. This is stuff I would want to see. And I think most people, if you talk to your neighbors, they just assume, well, I assume my state rep and state senator would know this, that they'd have this information. Say, no, they don't, and not due to any fault of their own. There's just so many layers of bureaucracy. It's so hard to get at this. And your state lawmakers are pressed for time, right? They've got a lot on their plate they're trying to get through. They don't have time to go through thousands of pages to try to put these pieces together. So it's really fun talking to the lawmakers and hearing from them how much this would benefit them.
Yeah, the level of sort of bureaucracy and I hate to say decentralization because I don't think that's exactly the right concept, but the idea that you have all these agencies who have the information exists, it's out there, but they all do it a little bit differently, and there is no unified way for anyone to go and find it is pretty wild, actually, especially when you think about the amount of money that's out there. So when we talk about we want the information to be available, I think sometimes folks sort of, especially folks who are whose job it is to decide how much something is going to cost the state, will sort of sit up in their chairs and go, boy, this sounds like a really big project. But the reality is that we're talking about really pretty basic information that shouldn't be a huge lift for us to find, aggregate, and put out there.
When you think about, all right, so federal grant, what do we want to know? How much money, right? I mean, that's very basic. All right, how much money was his grant? Who's it coming from? Who's it going to? So what federal agency is doling out the money? what state agency is it going to, and then who does the state agency award it to, and what's the purpose. And so, all right, hey, department, let's say the EPA is giving your, DEQ $1 million for wetland restoration. And where was that at? That should be very basic. All right, here's the agency, here's the money, and this is the project. Did it happen? Did it get fixed? That information's there. Right? Someone has that. Someone has to report that to the federal government. Someone has to report it somewhere. But right now, when we talk to people sort of in this, like, well, we don't, someone has maybe the monetary piece. All right, we know how much money was sent over here, but we don't know exactly what the full description of the project is, but someone else would have that. It's like, all right, we need to sort of put that all together. That should all be in one place instead of, compartmentalized like that. Let's put that all together in a nice, easy way that everyone can see. It sort of makes sense that you would have kind of one-stop shop that you can see how much money, what it go for, and then the question that everyone wants to know, was it successful, right? I mean, if it's a money to build a bridge, did the bridge get built or not? Let's know. And if it didn't, we should know where did that money go? And so that's really what we're asking for.
Yeah, and it's not a hard concept, but it's surprisingly difficult to do legislatively because of all these questions about, well, what does that look like, right? And I think folks sort of sit back and say, well, is it something that we have to put on TV? Do we have to do this? Is it a website? And there are a whole bunch of different ways that this could look. And maybe you could talk a bit about how those different paths branch out as far as how do you take the information, assuming it's already out there, you manage to aggregate it, and then how do we get that out to the public in a way that they can actually see it, digest it in an understandable format for the average taxpayer and the average citizen, and then sort of have the information that they need to start asking these questions? Because you can't really ask the questions until you know where to start, right?
Right. I mean, it does. You are relying on an educated populace that kind of knows, all right, we have to start to look into this. One thing that I've shared, and you're actually the one that pointed this out to me, is Colorado does a great job on education dollar transparency. You can Google it, Colorado education dollar transparency, and there's a state website, this dashboard that you can see where all the money is going to, what schools, what school district, what the purpose of the dollars are. And it's kind of fun. You play around with it for a little while and you start to see where these dollars are going. I think that's what we would like to see, and that's not going to happen overnight, but something like that with federal grants where you can easily go to this website and start to see where these dollars are flowing. Now, that's going to take a little bit of time. Maybe that doesn't happen this year, but I think that's a good end result of saying we have something that's very easily accessible, especially, and we started talking about this, with AI today. It should be pretty easy to find this information and put it out there for people to go and sort through. If you just put it into this giant spreadsheet that's 1,000 pages long with a whole bunch of numbers and no one knows what they're understanding, there's no value in that, right? I mean, there's information, and then there's information that's actually valuable. Right now, it appears there's just a whole lot of information that no one really knows how to decipher. We need to put it in a manner that a normal person, a reasonable standard that say, hey, I can actually read through this and begin to understand what these grants are, what they're for, and how much money they are.
Right, and it's imminently doable, right? So I remember when the education website, the financial transparency website was sort of coming to fruition legislatively in the mid-2010s, there was all this consternation and all this fighting over it. And there were eggs flying and tomatoes flying all over the Capitol, and the general refrain was, these budgets are far too complicated. You just don't understand. This is not possible. We can't build it. Eventually, the legislation passed anyway, and sure enough, they did build it. And what we've got now is, I think, one of the best tools in the country to be able to pull up a school district or an individual school and look at not how every single dollar was spent, because that can get very difficult, but meaningful line items about how that money is going out the door. And you think about being able to do that in a system as complex and multi-layered as education, where we're throwing tens of billions of dollars every year into it between local and state and federal funding. The idea that we can't do that with a few $100 million in federal grants that have very constrained purposes is wild. We absolutely can, and we've done it before many times.
Yeah, it's amazing how often government will say, well, we can't do something, and it requires a little pushing, a little prodding, and sometimes you have to force their hand and say, no, you have to. And it's amazing when you pass a bill, all these people that said it can't happen, like, well, now it's a law, so we have to, and lo and behold, they made it happen. And it's stuff that you see in the private sector all the time, that they can't take no for an answer. government bureaucracies are very resistant to change. And I'm not saying that they were lying when they said they couldn't do it. I'm sure they probably thought they couldn't do it. But it's amazing how when you force them, say, but you have to, we're going to require that. A lot of times they find a way, and you showed it with the education thing. Same thing with federal grants. There's been some pushback here and there. Mostly we're getting very positive response, but a little bit of pushback, and then you start to say, all right, well, you did with education. And it was funny because some of these individuals didn't know that this education transparency dashboard existed. And then you say other states have done this, and say, all right, it is very possible. This isn't, a lift that's just too far. No, it's very doable. It just requires the political will to do it. And I think we can have that happen. I mean, we're seeing great response from both Republicans and Democrats in the legislature.
Yeah, it's been an amazing issue to work on just because of the level of alignment across those different factions, that if we can come up with the how, which I think is solvable, and come up with a way to present it to somebody that actually makes sense and isn't this inscrutable spreadsheet that you need to be, a math PhD in to interpret, then we can get this out there, and it's definitely doable, even if it takes a couple years, even if there's a little bit of patience involved. Not everything happens instantaneously with government, as you know, but moving in the right direction is a way to start providing some sunshine, some transparency, and letting folks get the information that they need to start better understanding how money is moving around in government, and then how that's affecting their lives and the stuff that they care about. So it's a really incredible project, and one that I've been really happy to work on. So, Stephen, if somebody wanted to learn more about your work on the federalism issue or any of the other issues that you work on, or more about SPN or support you, where would they go?
The first place I'm going to tell them to go is go to federalismscorecard.com. That's federalismscorecard.com. We put together a scorecard where we rank the states on your policies and practices regarding protecting yourself against federal overreach. Federal grant transparency is one of those. That's one we focus on here in Colorado. There's a number of other ones there. That's a great spot to learn, to sort of see, all right, where does your state rank to other states, and where are some areas that you can improve? So go check us out there. A lot of great information there.
Is there a donate button somewhere that somebody could click if they wanted to help?
You might have to go to State Policy Networks for that. I think that's spn.org.
Great, spn.org.
And yeah, we'd love to have your support.
That's right. Everybody likes a donation. So, Stephen, thanks very much for joining us on this one. It's a really interesting topic. Hopefully, we will be able to have you back on and have an update that is about showing off this new transparency mechanism. But until then, we got a lot of work to do. So thank you for taking time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here.
You bet. That'll do it for today's episode of the Straight Up 30. We'll be back next week with another policy issue that matters. Until then, take care.